I'm Harvey Mansfield, and this is the program on constitutional government, our Friday lunchtime series, the first of, I think, 5 meetings we've got scheduled for this fall. And our speaker today is Roderick MacFarquhar, who's Emeritus Professor Leroy R. Williams, Professor of History and Political Science at Harvard. That chair used to belong to one of my mentors, or at least early professors, William Yandell Elliott.
Yes, he was the scourge of one of my professors, John King Fairbank.
He was a kind of tyrant to me, too. So we all have good memories of him.
Later, Benjamin Schwartz occupied that.
Benjamin Schwartz, yeah. So now Rod was formerly chairman of the Gov Department, one of our very best, perhaps rivaling James Q. Wilson for the best chair in the government department in the last 50 years.
There are too many colleagues here. Don't say this. Someone may contradict you.
I'm saying this. I'm old and I'm saying this. And he's also been director of the Fairbanks Center. Before coming to Harvard, he lived in a country called England, and he was a TV journalist and was elected to Parliament, which is a club of non-exclusive club elected by people from the outside. And to justify his being a professor, he's written books, and one of them is China Under Mao, and then his famous trilogy on the origins of the Cultural Revolution, Mao's Last Revolution, and he's also edited and written part of the Cambridge History of China. So this is Rod MacFarquhar. He's going to talk for a little while, and then we'll have some questions. And I think he wants to speak from the podium with his due authority.
The first rule of agitprop is stand up. Well, I'm not going to talk about constitutional government in the true sense, because that's a dangerous subject in China. People who talk about the Constitution and attempt to implement it end up being in places that they don't necessarily want to be. So the Constitution in China exists. It's a very fine Constitution in many ways, but implementation is lacking in some respects. What I want to talk about today is the rise of Xi Jinping. I was asked whether or not I had something to recommend to people to read beforehand. I said anyone who reads the New York Times will probably know everything I'm going to say anyway, because Xi Jinping has been very much in the news. And of course, this very day, there's an article in the New York Times by a Chinese American who worked for a Chinese company as a teacher, and it seemed that everyone fiddles in China. Tax avoidance is rampant, and that'll be a little bit of what I want to talk about. But I can refer you to an article I wrote in last month's book issue of the New York Review, which probably will put out what I have to say more carefully than I will say today. It was written several weeks before it was published, and therefore it does not include what I will talk about briefly today, since I'm not an economist. That is the stock market gyrations in China and the government's attempts to do something about it. So, Xi Jinping is coming here this month for, among other things, a state visit to the American president, and all sorts of cries have been raised by people that he shouldn't be invited because of what's happening in China, but the visit will certainly go ahead. And he has become a very prominent figure in the world, much more prominent than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. Remember him? Probably not, but who was much more low profile. So let me say a few things first about Xi Jinping and why he's there as General Secretary of the party and President of China, which two offices now always go together. Xi Jinping is a princeling, which, as many of you will guess, it means that he is the son of a senior revolutionary figure. In his case, not quite as senior as some princelings, but nevertheless senior enough to have been purged by Mao in 1962 and to have been resuscitated by Deng Xiaoping when Deng Xiaoping was able to do that. A man from the northwest, a man of some honour, it's thou said, and one who was actually friendly with, I think, the Panchen Lama, which is held to his credit by people who are concerned about Tibet. So Xi Jinping was someone who it was possible to think of as the next leader of China, because under Hu Jintao the rumors were coming out of Beijing that the elders were wanting a princeling to succeed. Hu Jintao, as I say, very low-key, was selected by Deng Xiaoping. Why, we don't know, but he was, and he led the country for 8 years. But they figured that there should be a princeling to follow him, because both Hu Jintao and his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, had said that the country was in grave danger, the party was in grave danger because of the widespread corruption, which they both said could bring the party and the country, the communist state, down. And that's something which Xi Jinping himself was saying before he came to power. And they figured, the elders, that someone whose family was embedded in the revolution's history would be far more likely to want to exert himself, always a himself, for the preservation of the revolution than someone who was simply an apparatchik who had risen through the ranks by diligence. So there were at least two obvious princelings. Xi Jinping was not the most obvious one. The most obvious one, and the one who really did a sort of Donald Trump equivalent within the Chinese system, was Bo Xilai. Some of you will remember that he was the man who was purged just before Xi Jinping came to power, though he tried after. He was purged partly because of a dramatic case where his wife was accused of murdering a British citizen. But Bo Xilai had already aroused waves, exactly like Donald Trump roused waves, because he had proclaimed a sort of Maoist citadel in Chongqing, the city province which he ran, and he was already a member of the Politburo. It was clear he was electioneering to get the top job, or at least to get into the Politburo Standing Committee, which consists at the moment of 7 people who are the rulers of China. And I think that people felt that, as people feel about Donald Trump, that this was too much of a good thing. They wanted people who wouldn't make waves, and they certainly didn't want people who made waves which reflected the old Maoist ways. I don't believe for a minute that Bo Xilai was in fact a Maoist or had any ideas of restoring Maoism. It was simply a way to get the attention of his colleagues and to get into the top leadership. But be that as may, he was purged. Xi Jinping is a far different person. Willie Warlap Lum, a Hong Kong-based long-time analyst of the Chinese leadership, has given us a sketch of his background, suggesting that he did nothing big while he was in the provinces learning his way and moving up the greasy pole. And that obviously was the mark of his success, because no one in the Chinese system should make waves before they get to the top, because that's the surest way for them not to get to the top, as Bo Xilai proved. And so Xi Jinping bided his time. Hu Jintao did the same, but he didn't make waves even when he did come to power. And he was eventually selected as the leader to succeed Hu Jintao. Now, the important thing I would stress about his selection is, this is the first time since the selection of Mao Zedong himself that the leader of the Chinese Communist Party was selected by his peers. In the case of Mao, prior to Mao, people were basically selected by the Soviet-backed Comintern. Mao was the first one to be selected on the Long March, as the leader, or obviously the potential leader. He wasn't actually made leader at that point, but clearly the up-and-coming leader by his peers in the desperate straits that they were in on the Long March. So after that time, leaders were selected by the leader. Mao selected his successors. Harvard professors can't do this, however much they try. The leaders were selected by the leaders. Mao had a series of lack of success. His final choice did succeed, but was quickly unseated. Deng Xiaoping also selected his successors, also with lack of success by his standards. But finally, his final selection, Hu Jintao, did succeed. And he stayed in power. So we have a new ball game. Someone selected by his peers, and therefore someone who has not just been plucked out by a whim, perhaps, or by a mistaken impression of someone's abilities and courage. But we then have someone who has been selected by his peers, and they haven't selected the others. The other 6 members of the Politburo Standing Committee were not selected, nor were the members of the Politburo, current Politburo, selected to take that leadership position. So in my view, this gives Xi Jinping a legitimacy over his colleagues which no previous leader has had. And I think that what we have seen over the last couple of years, 3 years, has been his exercise of that leadership that he has concealed carefully while he was coming up the provincial ladder, and now he is asserting himself in no uncertain way. The other thing you should know about Xi Jinping, and I don't know if we don't have enough examples yet, I think, to know if this is typical, is that he is a cultural revolution baby, so to speak. He is the first leader of China who went through the Cultural Revolution as a young person and was persecuted. Because his father had been purged, he did not join the elite Red Guards. He was eventually sent down to the countryside and was, according to an official biography, a mixed-up kid when he got to the countryside, but emerged from that countryside experience a potential leader of China. So we don't know. I have a former student who's now a professor in Hong Kong, Chinese, who is of that generation, who was a Red Guard leader, who was of non-princeling background and was a Red Guard leader. And he sort of has a soft spot for the idea that maybe a Red Guard generation leader will be something different. And I think so far he has proved to be something very different from the past. Now, what is Xi about? Well, first and foremost, he is about what all leaders of all governments are about, and that is the preservation of power, preservation of your party in power. In America and Britain, we have to submit to, regretfully in my case, to the judgment of the electorate, and you may be rejected, and the government may be rejected. But in the case of China, that's not currently an issue. And the issue is, how do you preserve the party in power? And why is that an issue? I mean, it's been in power since 1949. That's a long, long time. Why should it be an issue? I think it's an issue for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's an issue because the party was trashed during the Cultural Revolution. It was the target of the Cultural Revolution, not the intellectuals. They were just slapped away in passing, so to speak. The party was the target. Mao wanted to revolutionize the party, and the only way to do it was to thrust the Red Guards, the students, at them and see who stood up and who fell down and who rose above the tumult. And that trashing of the party resulted in a lack of legitimacy. You cannot see the high and the mighty paraded in a stadium and denounced and spat upon and made to do the airplane position and still feel that, who are these people? I mean, these people I should respect? No, it's not the attitude you would have towards people who've gone through that. And this happened from top to bottom. Many survived, of course, but the party itself as an institution was trashed. Even though Mao's idea was to rebuild the party as a more revolutionary organization, nevertheless, he undermined it in the process of doing that. Now, the party then emerges from the Cultural Revolution Deng Xiaoping rehabilitates people, either posthumously or in reality, gives them offices, gives them apartments, gives them cars and chauffeurs, depending on their seniority. And it seems like the party will come back to normal. But in my view, and I have no way of proving this, but in my view, there was a change of attitude among the party members, half of whom incidentally joined during the Cultural Revolution. The change of attitude is as follows. Mao's slogan for the party was "Serve the people." And that was a slogan which I'm sure that a great majority of the party, and especially in the 50s, less so in the 60s, took to heart. But what happened during the Cultural Revolution was that, having served the people, the chairman proceeded to wipe the floor with the cadres and to unleash society against the state. And I think what happened psychologically is that when Deng Xiaoping proclaimed a new slogan, "To get rich is glorious," and encouraged the growth of the economy out of the slough of despond into which it had been left by Mao, I think that what happened was that the cadres said, "We served the people." And where did it get us? It got us all sorts of hardship, all sorts of beatings, and some of our friends and colleagues were even killed. And now he's saying, "To get rich is glorious." Why shouldn't we get rich? Now, I'm not saying that there was no corruption under Mao, of course. And the story I love is the story in Shanghai in the 50s, when there was a campaign against rats. And people had to fulfill a quota. So many rats had to be produced. And it's very difficult eventually to fulfill that quota. So some Shanghai bright boys got together and started breeding rats and selling them. So there was corruption under Mao, but not to the extent that every leader of China has admitted it is today. And so one of the things that Xi Jinping is about is the elimination of corruption. I mean, all leaders everywhere want to eliminate corruption. But the way that they talk about China today, you would think you were in, well, I hesitate to say, but people have been saying it, say Greece, where they don't pay taxes or so on, or other countries in Europe, or other countries, but on a far grander scale, because the takings are so much bigger, the possibilities are so great. The billionaires have already emerged in China. And so the corruption is widespread. And Xi Jinping decided that he would do more than Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, his predecessors, had done. He would really have a campaign against this. And he put Wang Qishan, an old friend and colleague and a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, in charge of this, in charge of an organization called the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, which is charged with this kind of task of finding out the bad eggs who should be thrown out of the party. And this has become a fearsome thing. This has not been, as some people thought at first, a sort of slap on the wrist for a few people, that a few government officials at a low level would be targeted because they'd had a banquet which was outside the spending ratios that were normally prescribed for it. So those kind of people have been targeted, but that's not the main set of targets. Now, all of you, having read the New York Times regularly over the last many years, or many of you anyway, will know that this goes to the highest in the land. Just before he retired as Prime Minister, it was revealed in the New York Times, I think, that Wen Jiabao's, the Prime Minister, was not personally corrupt as far as anyone knew, but that his wife was somehow the biggest jewel person in the country, and that his kids were also involved in all sorts of scams. And there's no question that the senior former Politburo Standing Committee member Zhou Yongkang, who retired in 12 when Xi came to power and has just been given a life sentence, that he was massively corrupt. No question about this. So it goes from the top to the bottom. And Xi Jinping came into power vowing that he would go for the tigers and the flies. Now, this is a fearsome operation, and not just fearsome to the people who are the targets. I mean, if you are in a ministry and suddenly a subset of the Discipline Inspection Committee comes to call, you're all sweating. You've already hidden your Rolex watch. You've already stopped going to certain restaurants. And you've stopped wearing clothes you bought on your last trip to Paris. But if they come to call, then it's much more serious than that. It may include getting at you for that, and perhaps if you admit to that and tell tales on someone else, you might get off. Who knows? But this is a fearsome thing that is happening in China for the high and the mighty. And it's also fearsome for the flies. Most of the reported 500 demonstrations or riots or whatever they are in China every day are because of land seizures by local cadres in the pay of local businessmen who want to build factories, whatever. This is also, of course, corruption. And it's one way where local governments line their pockets, but also one way they function, because they don't always get enough money from the central government or the provincial government to carry out the tasks with which they are supposed to be responsible for. So at both levels, tigers and flies, you have considerable alarm at this campaign. And especially since Xi Jinping, when he came in, said, this is not a campaign. I think the person who translated this must have been studied English at Harvard or somewhere. The campaign was not going to end with a whimper. It was going to be persisted with to the bitter end. And that may be something which Xi Jinping may regret having committed himself to. Because let's think of the dangers as a result of this campaign. The dangers are that he will be united against. No one would have united against Mao. Though Mao may have been a little paranoid at times that people might, because he saw what happened to Stalin's reputation, he saw what happened to Khrushchev, purged. So he may have thought that people would go after him, but there was no chance of that happening. He was the Lenin and Stalin of the revolution. He was the big figure. But Xi Jinping, for all his skill and his toughness, which we assume he has, is not that. He's not Mao. He could be dismissed. And you have to think what the tigers are in danger of. They're in danger of losing their wealth, their families, their reputations, their place in commerce history. And that legacy of their role in the Communist Revolution is very important to people. Biographies and autobiographies are written non-stop in China, from upper levels to lower levels. And so the idea that there may be a possible move against Xi to unseat him is not unheard of. Now, in these circumstances, the chairman, Mao, was always relying upon the military for his last line of defense. And Xi Jinping has indicated that that is also his line of defense. He has had a brief career in the military as aide to a general, but to a minister, but he's not really a military man. But about 18 months ago, a number of very senior military figures did something which I've never seen before. They all printed in the People's Daily, the official paper of the party, their loyalty to the party and to its General Secretary, who is also, among his many jobs, chairman of the Military Affairs Committee of the party. And that, of course, was an indication to his colleagues, look, watch out, I've got the military behind me, like Chairman Mao. But since he's also gone after the military, two very, very senior generals have been targeted for selling offices to their colleagues. I don't mean physical offices, I mean ranks. The loyalty of the army in this period may be suspect. I mean, in my view, the generals may have signed that because they felt they had no option. Maybe they were loyal, of course. But this was a get-out-of-jail-free card. You know, I've said my loyalty, now you don't attack me. And so far as I know, none of those 18, I think it was, have been attacked. But if the going gets rough and the military keep on being targeted like the party leadership have been targeted, then who knows whether they will stay loyal. Everyone is thinking of their own interests, their own families, their own kids, and so on. This is why, incidentally, billions of Chinese money and foreign exchange goes abroad to safeguard a bolt hole. This is why no person here is the object of this remark. This is why many Chinese send their kids abroad as a safeguard, because they learn how to function in other societies, whether it's Canada, Australia, Europe, America. And if the worst comes to the worst, they're there to hold the family in. We know, we've seen this incidentally happen already once in Hong Kong before '97. The Hong Kong families, many of them sent their kids abroad or a relative abroad, so much so that Vancouver became known as Kongcouver. So this is a strategy which people can adopt. That is a defensive strategy, and the question that is in the air, I think, is will they turn to an offensive strategy, thinking that he is destroying the party in this corruption campaign. And let's look at it at the flies level. Who wants to join the party if they're therefore going to be subject to all sorts of corruption investigation? And what's worse, they won't be able to be corrupt, which was a perk of the office. I once asked a local party secretary, not so many years ago, how much he got as a party secretary, and he told me a sum. It wasn't very much, and I said so. It was not very much. I said, he said, but my construction company, they're there, and he told me the sum there. That was a good sum. So there is corruption to be had at the lower levels, and if you can withstand the anger of the peasants, you can do a deal with the local businessmen. And that's the way you go. And if you look at the article, and I do recommend it to you in today's New York Times by this Chinese American who worked in Beijing, it's widespread. It's totally widespread. But it's so widespread that think of the implications. There are 85 million members, roughly, give or take, members of the Chinese Communist Party. I use the number 80 million because it's easier to calculate while I'm standing up. Suppose only a mere 10% are corrupt. That's 8 million people. Nothing in China. But then suppose one spouse. This is not untypical. We've seen these cases all the time. One spouse, 16 million. One child, 24 million. One sibling, 32 million. One sibling's spouse, 40 million people. That's with 10% corruption. And that is the kind of pattern we've seen in the unveiling of corruption cases so far. There's the nuclear family, and then there are the non-nuclear representatives. The article on Xi Jinping in Bloomberg, which preceded the one on Wen Jiabao, indicated that Xi Jinping's nuclear family, himself, his wife, and his daughter, who was a Harvard student until recently, were not corrupt. But his siblings, his outer family, had gained enormously while Xi Jinping rose up. And it is said to me by Chinese not long ago that Xi Jinping's personal reputation went up after that article, because everyone read it, of course, because he was not corrupt. New York Times said so, so he couldn't be corrupt. So, good for him. So, you see what I mean? If we are talking not of 10%, but a much bigger percentage of the party, think of the enormous damage that can be done. I know quite well someone called Li Rui, who's in his 90s and was once a secretary to Mao till he fell foul of him, was purged. He came back after the Cultural Revolution was made because he was a very senior guy, a very smart guy. He was made deputy head of organization department, very powerful position. And he wanted to purge all those people who joined the party during the Cultural Revolution. That would have been 19 million people. So he was forced to retire, because that would have been a massive, massive destruction. In fact, it would have been the Cultural Revolution all over again, albeit kinder and gentler. So the impact on the party of this corruption campaign cannot be underestimated. People don't take decisions. Xi Jinping, one of the ways we know how powerful he is, because Xi Jinping has taken over the leadership of the main Economic Affairs Committee. It should have been the Prime Minister's role to do that, but Xi Jinping has taken it over. And the point is that with that powerful position, he is able to target all sorts of people. And I think that people will see that this campaign, if it doesn't go on, if it does go on, it will result in all the reform efforts, and there a very strong and good reform program was put forward a couple of years ago. The reform efforts will not go on because people are too frightened to take decisions, which may result in, if they go wrong, in them being accused of corruption or favoritism or whatever. You can see what can happen by what took place after I did that article in the New York Review. With what happened with the stock exchange, it's not just that the Chinese leadership clearly doesn't know how to handle a stock exchange, doesn't know how to handle a free market properly. It's more that they are looking for saboteurs. They are looking for people who have done the dirty on the market, who are selling things they shouldn't be selling. In other words, they're treating the whole bubble that burst, a bubble which incidentally the government talked up a great deal in the first half of this year. They're treating it as the bursting of the bubble as a crime, as corruption. And that shows that why people in government positions, in economic positions, are reluctant to take decisions. Who knows what will happen if their decision is wrong? What will they be accused of? So the result of the corruption campaign is that the massive reform program, the transformation of China from an industrial exporting country to a consumer growth-led country, has been held up. And it may be that some of Xi Jinping's colleagues are wondering if they'll ever get back to reform, if the reform can take place in this kind of an atmosphere that China is currently in. I want to finish with a couple of remarks about foreign policy, since that's also what you read in the New York Times. China has emerged from a period which was characterized by a Deng Xiaoping remark that, keep a low profile. We're not big anywhere in the world yet. Let's keep a low profile while we develop. And the assumption has been that Xi Jinping decided, well, the United States is clearly on the decline as a result of the 2008 and successive recession, and now is the time when we can emerge and show our power. I think he has two main motives. One is to put a marker down for territories which the Chinese, under some construction of ancient maps, may genuinely think is their territory. And they want to do that and to assert their leadership role in East and Southeast Asia, the traditional role that they felt they had, though that traditional role was done by soft power, by the impact of their culture on their neighbors, not by hard power. Not all the time, anyway. I think the second objective is that he wants to arouse, as part of his support for his campaign, a sense of patriotism and nationalism. And that if he can picture himself in the eyes of his people as a great nationalist, patriotic leader asserting China's rights in East and Southeast Asia, then the ability of his potential opponents to bring him down will be so much less. I think, in fact, that that's a myth. I think that if his opponents feel so threatened that they themselves see no good future for themselves in Xi's China, then I don't think whatever nationalist credentials he may have will stop them from acting. So the question at the end of this talk is, as he comes to America, as he does an end run around the president by having all the high-tech companies to a conference in Seattle to show them that they're his friends and not the president's friend, in case the president raises cybercrime. So the question that is left is she there for the long haul, or is he creating so many waves in China that some people will feel they have to act before they're drowned? Thank you.
Well, have a seat. Do you want to take the questions? Or?
Sure, if they don't mind me speaking with my mouth full.
Or would you rather, therefore,
No.
that I...
Go ahead.
Okay.
I mean, if you want to talk for some length, go ahead.
No, I don't. Thank you. Thank you. I may have a question.
Thank you. Could you just say a word about what corruption is, or is there a consistency in the persecution and prosecution of corruption there? Is it only the richest? In a corrupt society, don't you have to be corrupt to survive? And so I'm just wondered what the standards are of who is it the most, a final piece of that would be, is it the most dangerous people that he thinks could take him out of power that he's pursuing?
Well, let me answer that question first by saying there are people in China who feel that he is in fact targeting his potential or actual enemies, and that the corruption is just a facade. I don't happen to think that's true, but it is, I think, correct to say that so far as I know, and something's happened in the last few days that hasn't been reported in the New York Times, that no princeling of any consequence has bitten the dust, not as a result of Xi Jinping's actions anyway. I think that the corruption is, read this article today. I mean, the corruption is so widespread that you almost cannot act if you are not corrupt. American institutions will have this experience all the time. What do they do when it is part of the normal give and take? What you might think is corruption is actually just a gift from one friend to another. So it is widespread, and I think that the corruption at the grassroots is, of course, encouraged by the fact that they all know that it prevails up top. And that's why it's such a massive task, so massively difficult for Xi Jinping and Wang Xishan to actually get to grips with it and root it out. I mean, you never root out corruption 100% anyway, but to actually make a real dent in it. And the point, and he does not want, this is where he is against the Cultural Revolution type approach, he does not want people to help in this task. He wants it centrally controlled. If you start to get together a group of friends and offer some names of local officials whom you know are corrupt, you'll probably end up in prison because it's got to be controlled. He doesn't want it to get out of hand. But that's not much consolation for the people who are going to be attacked by his people. And let me give you a comparison, if I may, which I talked about in my article. And that is, he's trying to save the Communist Party. Gorbachev is a big thing with him. He talked about Gorbachev and his failure to keep the Communist Party of the Soviet Union alive. And he's obviously determined not to be Gorbachev. But in fact, if you look at what Gorbachev was doing, he was doing exactly what Deng Xiaoping started. Reform and opening up, perestroika and glasnost. The problem was in the Soviet Union that the bureaucrats had not been trashed by a cultural revolution. They had been in power for decades, and they resisted, and most of the Politburo did not go with Gorbachev. So he unleashed glasnost, but a very sort of volunteer-type army, publishers, journalists, academics, people who could be batted away very easily. Xi Jinping has a much stronger instrument than Gorbachev to do the same thing. He's got this powerful committee which has been there for decades and decades in the center of the Chinese Communist Party's leadership, and they have power to do whatever they want. So this is what Xi Jinping is doing, and this is where I think people in the other leaders may worry, quite apart from their personal problems. What he is doing is extremely dangerous for the party. He's got a far stronger weapon than Gorbachev ever had.
How do you define corruption? Is it just choosing not on the basis of merit, or is it not on the say Max Weber acting against the norms of the legal rational bureaucracy?
Well, it's corruption is in many forms, obviously. Money is the root of it. The basic level corruption, which is sort of was everywhere until people started hiding it, was probably having meals at the public expense which you shouldn't have had, rather lavish banquets which were not allowed by normal standards. And then it goes up to utilizing national enterprises, national firms, in order to siphon off billions, and to share those billions with your. When Zhou Yongkang, the former leader of the political, security forces, who was purged this past year, when he was purged, they unveiled before they got to him all his associates in the various jobs he'd done. And it's sort of like cutting the brushwood away, and then finally you get to the big fir tree and cut it down. So corruption comes in many forms. Land sales to businessmen by local authorities, siphoning off billions from the national enterprises. There are all sorts.
Yes, if I could, I'd like to press on this corruption issue, picking up on both previous questions. In this country, and having grown up in Boston politics, I know corruption very well. Obviously we have notions of rights and the rule of law, and people feel cheated relative to those kinds of standards. We also don't have, strong sense of family bonds the way I take it the Chinese do, which obviously is part of sort of one's conception of what one owes people and a source of corruption. So I'm just wondering that if you could speak a little bit more about what would be the basis of objection to corruption in a society like China. If there is no rule of law, if there's no notion of rights, or if I'm wrong, if one has a very strong sense of one's obligations to one's family, it seems to me that it has to play out very, very differently than the way we conceive of it.
Yes, I think that's a fair point. I think that there is no rule of law. There is rule by law. And one of the things that came out of the Cultural Revolution was a determination by the leadership that they weren't going to be caught like they were by Mao in 1966. And so they wanted rule by law so that there was predictability. So rule by law exists, and the Constitution is full of rights. They're just not always adhered to. And that's why the lawyers there's been this targeting of rights lawyers over the last few months, and many of them have been put away. I think, yes, that many people have argued this, not just anthropologists, but that there is a different concept in not just in China but in other parts of East Asia as well, that of what is corruption. It's giving a gift to a business colleague or someone you are doing business with. Is that corruption? Or is it simply a way of giving a colleague, a friend, a token of your esteem? So yes, that's true. I think there can be no doubt, however, that if a cadre illegitimately, even by the standards of the party and ruled by law, sells land from under peasants' feet and houses, that's corruption, because he gets a kickback for it. And if someone like Zhou Yongkang, who apparently milked all sorts of national enterprises, takes billions out of as a result of his job, that's corruption. If the senior general in the Military Affairs Commission is actually selling ranks to people, that's corruption. So I think there are many instances of corruption in China which everyone would agree was corruption, wherever society is.
I've been trying to several times giving lectures, and I really didn't feel. One thing I discovered when I was there was that the two most famous political theorists in China are Harvey Mansfield and Michael Sandel. I was giving lectures on political theory, and I kept hearing these names, Mansfield, Sandel, of course. And the second thing I learned the hard way was that legitimacy was the number one subject in Chinese political theory, which you could not talk about directly, but you could talk about indirectly by talking about Machiavelli or Aristotle or something like that. So,
Or some distant figure in Chinese history.
Yeah, exactly. But what strikes me from what you're saying is that this is a legitimacy problem, and it's in a way a kind of insoluble problem, since the party for a long time built its legitimacy on economic success. I remember being on trains where there was a little TV show at the front of the train organized by the Communist Party, where the Communist Party is telling all the people riding on the train the wonderful things the party is doing, building bridges, building dams, everything's getting better, standard living's rising. This is a big sell that they are making China better for ordinary people. That's their legitimacy. And I heard that over and over again in China, that legitimacy comes from economic success. And it seems what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to create a different type of legitimacy, which is a moral legitimacy coming from getting rid of corruption. But if, as you say, getting rid of corruption is freezing the economy, and people don't want to engage in economic activity because they're afraid of being, you need to have the corruption to get anything done in China, that there's no normal way of doing business, then they've got a real problem there, because the more legitimate you are from the point of view of moral corruption, getting rid of morality, the less successful you're going to be economically. Does that make any sense to you? I mean, I think what they need to do is to find a way to be successful economically without corruption, or to get the corruption out of the economic gears in some way. But what you seem to be saying is that trying to stop corruption is inhibiting the economic growth.
No, I wasn't saying it was inhibiting economic growth. What I was saying was that the reform program has sort of been frozen because people are frightened to take decisions. I think you're absolutely right about the importance of economic legitimacy, because the legitimacy that came from conquering China in 1949, that really disappeared with the famine and with the Cultural Revolution. And so over the last 35 years or so, the economic legitimacy has been very important. That's why Zhurongji rode so high. I think that that's probably a major reason why they're looking for saboteurs and criminals in the bursting of the stock exchange bubble, when it's just the bursting of a stock exchange bubble, and why they're taking all sorts of steps to prevent it continuing, because that is the legitimacy. The problem for Xi Jinping is, how do we find a grounds for legitimacy? Well, we can have a cultural revolution, which he's trying to do, by changing people from corrupt to pure. Mao wanted to change them from bourgeois-oriented to revolutionary. Xi Jinping wants the kind of gentler cultural revolution, change them to purity, but much more difficult, actually, to get them to do that.
That's the interest of Confucius.
And the reason for this is that there is no ideological basis for legitimacy. It was not just that they conquered China, it was that they had Marxism-Leninism adding on Mao Zedong thought. And that told you about history, and it gave you the design for the future. You knew the past, you understood where the country should go and how it should get there. That was a great basis for legitimacy. Well, Deng Xiaoping kiboshed that. Mao Zedong thought and Marxism-Leninism were one of the four cardinal things that could not be attacked, but they're put on the shelf and not adhered to. Samuelson's more important than Mao Zedong thought to current China. And so what you have with China today is a lack of ideological legitimacy. Confucianism and Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, were not just about statecraft, they're about how you link family and state. And they prescribed what those families also should do. And there's nothing like that to link the two together. That's one of the reasons, I think, for the nationalist path that Xi Jinping has chosen. And the negative thing that he's done is to try to exclude anything that smacks of the West, which is why he said, don't send your kids to the United States or to Europe for education, but actually didn't pull his kid out before she got a degree. I think that the negatives are constitutional government, anything about rights, anything about freedom of the press, all these things that have been absorbed by generations, now 2 or 3 generations of Chinese students coming here and elsewhere, and have taken back to China in many cases. All these things are illegitimate. And that's very negative. So if you can't have an economic legitimacy because you are not handling the thing properly, and you don't have an ideological legitimacy, which links you and the people together, what happens? Well, an estimated 75 million people have turned to Christianity because there's no there, so they are looking for something. And he is therefore in this cleft stick of trying to purify the party without really presenting very much in place of the old ideology, except China Dream.
Right.
China Dream. I asked one person, what's your China Dream? What's the China Dream mean to you? Being able to afford an apartment in Beijing. To a woman of a certain age, that my son gets a job when he gets out of college. And to a young man elsewhere, huh? So you've raised a very important point, yes.
So given all the dangers of the campaign and the high price that China has to pay for it, and I suppose that it is not as if she did not foresee it before he launched the campaign, and I also suppose that the campaign was not only motivated by his will. So I was wondering whether I could just say a few words.
Motivated by his what, is it?
By his will.
Will, yeah.
So I was wondering whether I could just say a few words about the necessity of the campaign at this stage.
Well, I think that, as I said a few minutes ago, there are many people who think that this is just a factional struggle. I don't. I think that, of course, he's using it to get rid of some people who might be particularly dangerous to him, but I think he genuinely wants to have a uncorrupt society. He knows that it's delegitimizing the party day by day, more and more. So I think he may or may not have foreseen the problems. Who knows? No one's carried out a campaign like this against corruption in the past. There was the 3 anti, 5 anti in the early Mao period, but that's nothing compared to what's happening now. So there's no experience, there's no guidelines to tell him what would be the impact.
Is it possible that at this stage, if there's not such a campaign, that the economic reform cannot be carried out, like cannot be continued? I mean, like the campaign is so serious at this stage that so it has prevented China to carry out its reform.
Well, I'm not sure what you're saying. Are you saying that without the campaign there'd be no reform, but that with the campaign there's no
I mean,
reform
like,
too?
are they related? Like the corruption problem has had such a severe impact on the use of Chinese resources, for example, like the party's use of the society's resources.
I think that I'm not the person who should answer this question. You should ask Bill Overholter, perhaps, of this, because I'm not an economist. But I think that the transformation of the economic arrangements of China could have been carried out without a massive corruption campaign that we're seeing. I may be wrong, and there would certainly be resistance because the bureaucrats have now recovered their standing since the Cultural Revolution was so long ago. But I think that with a more modest campaign, targeting both tigers and flies, but not with the relentlessness that the present campaign seems to have, I think they'd be more likely to have carried out the reform program. But I don't know. It's an unknowable thing.
Well, could I make a comment
Sure.
on this? There's always been corruption in the PRC. Under Mao, it was just about power. And now it's about the way power and money slosh around together. But the problem with both eras was a lack of rules or the lack of law. Mao had girlfriends in Zhongnanhai, and one day a soldier brushed the behind of one of these girls. Well, that was the end of the soldier. He was disappeared, as they say. No money involved. Now it's all about money. I don't quite think that she's doing as much as Rod does, or that he can do as much. I think the anti-corruption thing is popular in China, but I don't think it's anything more than a token. The internet is full of the question, where are the tigers in Fujian and Zhejiang? These are two provinces in southeast China where Xi Jinping was party secretary. And people have noticed that no one's been purged from there, so it makes them rather cynical. I think the two big challenges are what Rod referred to, the nationalism. Can the victim narrative that Xi Jinping has struck even more than Hu Jintao, can the victim narrative survive? I think it cannot survive much longer. He said to Obama, we must get beyond the Cold War mentality, with North Korea up there reminding us how difficult that is. But the anti-Japanese war, which they've just celebrated, it's a long time before the post-45 American alliance system that he dislikes so much. And then he goes on about the Opium War. So these historical events, I think it's a losing game for the leadership of the party. The second issue is about the economic reform, as Rod says. Chen Yizhi, a very excellent intellectual, he said once that if the concentration of state power can be reformed, then a command economy is also possible, but then you would need no reform. And he was involved in a think tank with Deng Xiaoping advising on these questions. So I really doubt that all these efforts at reform, trust the market 2 years ago, the market will be decisive. Well, the market hasn't been allowed to be decisive in the last couple of months. I don't think it's going to mean much. And ever since 1987, that party congress, where Judge Young said, we'll separate the party and the government, they've had these kind of zigs and zags, and I wonder if we aren't just in one more of those zigs and zags. Sorry to go on.
Well, I think we do disagree on the seriousness of the anti-corruption campaign. I think it's very close to his heart, and that it is something that he's going to pursue until it really endangers his position. And he may not know that it's endangered his position until it's over. So we'll have to disagree on that. But corruption, of course, has always been there, but not on the scale of this. And I'm talking about not corruption of power that exists everywhere, but I'm talking about financial corruption. Bill?
Changing over to the foreign policy line, when we talk about motivations for the more assertive policy, talk about using nationalism, showing Chinese leadership. Under Hu Jintao, time after time, he had to act tough to save his job. And it was, an awful lot of it was personal defensiveness. And I wonder if a lot of it under Xi Jinping isn't the same thing. He's alienated the party, the bureaucracy, the local government, the state enterprises, and the corrupt generals. So he needs some support. So what does he give the ones that he wants support? He gives them a lot of weapons and some islands. And just as in this country, we're very assertive because the Congress will only give money to the military, not to the State Department or anybody else. I wonder whether the sort of personal structural politics domestically isn't, in a way, it's the other side of a coin that you mentioned, which is the use of nationalism.
No,
But I'm just emphasizing this terrible personal vulnerability, which I think is terrible.
Well, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. I think that it is done to get the people behind him, to build up a constituency, which is frankly irrelevant. When if push comes to shove, what the people think will be irrelevant. But I think it also helps with the military because it gives them some toys, it gives them some action. The Navy and the Air Force now are getting more of the money than the Army, and that hope will balance the books against the generals he removes. And of course, he's promoting a few uncorrupt ones. Hopefully, uncorrupt.
Given the Chinese domestic situation and the American domestic situation, looking forward for the Xi Jinping-Obama's summit meeting in September, what would you expect anything substantial coming out of this summit meeting, or is this merely a photo op opportunity, a show, or do you expect anything substantive that could come out from this meeting?
Well, I think that just like Kennedy underestimated, Khrushchev underestimated Kennedy, I think that Xi Jinping, after their first visit, partly because Obama had bad advice, I think Xi Jinping underestimates Obama. And nevertheless, the American president,
In what way?
as a tough leader, No, Obama is a reasonable man, and he expects every other leader, foolish though it may be, to be reasonable, and that you have an argument, discussion, and somehow you work something out. That's what lawyers do. It's not what Chinese do. Not this Chinese anyway. And I think that nevertheless, whatever he thinks about Obama, and this is purely guesswork on my part, a meeting at the formal level of a state visit to the President of the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, is something that will resonate back in China much more than the parade on the 3rd of September. So he's doing it for that reason. I don't expect much to come out. If Obama is tougher now than he was 8 years ago, which I think he has been, he's been forced to be because of the domestic opposition he's faced, if he's tougher now, he will stick it to him about cybercrime. And that's why Xi Jinping is meeting with all the cyber companies in Seattle before he gets to Washington. And I don't think there'll be any massive agreement. That they got a mouse out on the environment out the last time was good, excellent. But I suspect we won't get anything. Certainly, I have no inside sources, but there's certainly been nothing in the American rumor mill or American press that suggests that there's something that they're going to hopefully get from him. And if they're going to stick it to him about cybercrime, which there has been a lot in the press about, then I think he will be equally tough in return. What he wants, however, not just for China, the Chinese people, but for the world, what he wants, however, is, I think, to project this idea of a new kind of relationship between major powers. And he does that just by being there. Who else can do this? I, Xi Jinping, for China can do it. It's China and America. That's what he wants to establish. And I think that, frankly, that the Americans were mistaken to buy into this. They didn't totally buy into it, but they seem to be buying into it. With, for instance, the Sunnylands meeting. What other leader was asked to Sunnylands meeting equivalent? No one. And I think that was a slap in the face to America's allies. So I think that Xi Jinping will get enormous amount out of this without a single agreement being signed. And if the American press talks about how Obama thumped the table and Xi Jinping resisted, better still.
Your view about the prospect of the new type of power relations is it's not going to form what the Chinese call new power.
I know. Well, from their point of view, it just means there are two of us, the G2. Yeah.
So one of the models of political economic reform in China has been these special economic development zones, Shenzhen and whatnot. I'm just curious your impression of the degree to which these have been insulated from issues of corruption. Are there really different sort of expectations about rule of law there, about economic transparency? Are they just of one cloth with the rest of the country? To what degree are these different and hope to reform, or to what degree are they not?
Well, to give you an answer that's based in reality, I'd have to have been to Shenzhen more recently than I was. I was there, I think, in 1986, when it was sort of an idea more than an actuality. And the one American businessman I talked to was in despair that it would ever be anything. Of course, he was wrong, and it's been fantastic. But I think probably, since that's where the two stock exchanges are, Shenzhen and Shanghai, I think it's probably like the rest of the country.
I'm not sure, I was late, so I'm not sure whether this has been covered, but I've been reading about China in the business press, and there's a characterization that their major problem is one of overall indebtedness. Do you agree with this description, or not? And how would you characterize it?
Well, I used to talk to, I haven't done it recently, but I used to talk to Larry Summers about this, and he, of course, slightly better economist than I am, because I'm not an economist at all. And he would say that, look, they've got a couple of trillion in national reserves. They're not going to go broke. But there's no question that the non-performing loans in China are enormous, enormous. And you'd have to ask an economist to know whether or not they can stave this off forever. But there are all sorts of ways in which the non-performing loans are smoke and mirrors disguise them. But everyone knows what they're like. One of my former students is a particular devotee of looking at these things. And he thinks, there are bulls and bears about the Chinese economy. And the bulls have had a good run, brought up short perhaps earlier this summer. But the bears have always said, in the long run, all this debt, it just doesn't work in economics. Now, Bill, you may have an economist's view about this.
They're in a financial squeeze. The local government debt problem is the worst part of it. They've been very dependent on property for growth, and properties in oversupply in a lot of places. And the overcapacity of the state enterprises means a lot of bankruptcies. But so they're going to go through some tough years. But they're not India and they're not Brazil. So they're not going to have a huge crash and go to 0% growth like Brazil. But growth is lower than the official numbers suggest, and the leaders know that. The leaders didn't ask the statisticians to fudge the numbers. They did an audit before the last Beta High meeting and discovered that the numbers were fudged more than usual. And they'll go lower than they are now. But again, it's not India, it's not Brazil. They have the resources to manage their way through a rather difficult deleveraging process.
What they say about Brazil is it's the land of the future and always will be. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So we came from Tsinghua and we missed your whole presentation. We have a very
I'll start again if you like.
sorry, we just have like a roughly 1 hour break. So I'd like to have two questions for you. So one is about China's decision-making process. That's, in last like 2 decades, we have sort of institutionalized our policy process. But now we saw, for the reasons of, as you said, economic legitimacy, that China tried to, or Xi tried to to launch a reform everywhere. We call it deepening comprehensive reform. So he actually creates like dozens of leadership small groups, and he tried to lead everything by himself. What I'd like to know your comments about this is that why he doing this, and why instead of relying on sort of institutionalized bureaucratics. And my second question is about the anti-corruption side. I thought most of the discussions are focused on this. So did you see any factors that could protect him from being betrayed after, after Wang Qishan now already had got a lot of power, and he already invited a lot of persons in each ministries and also provinces. So any significant factors to guarantee or to protect that the leaders being betrayed, but we always, when it's quite often observed in communist history.
Well, let me answer the second question first, because I did talk about this. I think that Xi Jinping is taking a very high-risk policy with his corruption campaign. the party could be demoralized and the top leadership could revolt against him. And I think that the verdict is out as to whether that will happen or not. He is attempting to both solidify his national position. You know, there's a cult of personality of Xi Jinping, as you're well aware, which is greater than Hu Jintao and even Jiang Zemin. There's a little yellow book of his sayings. So I think that what we are seeing is the growth of a personality cult in an attempt, along with other measures, hoping to placate the military, for instance, perhaps protecting a couple of provinces that he used to work in, as Ross Terrell mentioned, to have enough supporters that he will be protected. But it is a very risky policy, the way he's pursuing it. As for the decision-making process in China today, well, despite the much greater access to Chinese news and so on than in the Maoist era, despite the far bigger rumor mill and the internet and so on, I think the decision-making process is still fairly opaque. My understanding is that under Hu Jintao there was a regular meeting of the Parliamentary Standing Committee, and that's where decisions were taken, and Hu Jintao was very content that the blame or the responsibility should be shared. I don't know why Xi Jinping has taken upon himself to chair every major committee, including one which should be chaired by the Prime Minister. It may be that he, like others outside China, felt that the Prime Minister was not the right person to be in charge of the economy, so he wanted to put himself on top. But it would seem that he has decided to take personal responsibility, ultimately, for every major thing. The one thing he is not taking personal responsibility for, and which I think could be a way of merging the corruption campaign with something which is both beneficial to people and also anti-corruption. The one thing he's not taking charge of is the environment. And I think that the environmental disaster which the Communist Party of China has presided over the last 35 years is longer lasting and having a greater impact than even the massive deaths of the famine and the upheaval of the Cultural Revolution. But he's not going to take, once he takes responsibility for that, then you can assume that something is going to happen. But wisely, perhaps, from his point of view, he's not yet taken charge of that, even though there is more of an environmental movement today than there was. So I don't know how it's done, but I do think that he is making decisions and the Politburo Standing Committee is sort of going along with them. I mean, he's assigned, obviously, portfolios to each member and the Politburo members as well, but I think that it's he who is decisive.
Thank you.
Well, how would you sum up the Chinese Revolution? Did it succeed? Are its advances worth the price that was paid?
Well, I agree with, who was it? Camus, who said no revolution is worse than what it replaces. I think that the revolution was a failure in the sense that you have greater inequality in China today than before. And equality was certainly one of the objectives of the revolution. It was a failure in terms of one of the major objectives of the revolution because of Mao's various policies, and that is the rebirth of China. But under Deng Xiaoping, that rebirth has been taking place and has continued. So in that sense, the revolution has been successful. The question is, do they need the civil war for that to happen? You could argue that Chiang Kai-shek regime was enormously corrupt. One, incidentally, just recalls one thing. Former chief editor of the People's Daily, who later became somewhat of a dissident, said to me, you know, in Chiang Kai-shek's time, there was corruption, But you know what it was? It was 5% or 10%. Today he said the sky's the limit. And he lived through the Chiang Kai-shek era. I think you could argue that Chiang Kai-shek would have been so corrupt, and he was in, he could not do any land reform because his officer class owned land. I think that had Mao stuck with the policy of new democracy, which is a policy he evolved in 1940, which was designed to placate the middle ground, because at that time they needed that support. Had he stuck with that, as Zhou Enlai and Liu Shaoqi thought he was doing when they came to power, China would be very different, because what that policy said was, we don't know enough about agriculture to transform the countryside. We'll let the peasants do that. And we don't know enough about commerce and industry to nationalize everything. So we let them do that. And what Mao realized was that if that was the policy continued, then they would never do it. There'd never be a socialist China, because once you have established a strong peasantry with land reform and a strong industry and commerce, and China is booming, then that's it. That's the end of the socialist revolution. And he wasn't prepared to accept that. But had he allowed that to happen, even though there was an American boycott at the time, and maybe he wouldn't have gone the Korean War if they'd pursued that policy, who knows. But had he allowed those economic policies to persist, China might have had a little bit of a revolution economically long before it actually did. Probably doesn't answer your question.
No, it does. The lady in yellow had a question.
Well, I'm not sure. I think you've talked so much about this already, but I'm somewhat confused as to. So you started out your talk saying he's doing this because the party is rapidly losing legitimacy on account of the corruption. But on the other hand, you've also now been describing the conundrum he's in, because you say in the end, whether he has the support of the people doesn't matter. It won't help him from being toppled. He needs the military, and so that seems somewhat contradictory to me. If he's acting out in order to preserve the party, because I don't know, it's in danger of losing popular support, and there's maybe some kind of popular unrest looming. I don't know. But on the other hand, the people are not going to be able to help him no matter what. I've heard a lot about the Chinese system and the party system being more meritocratic than other systems. In order to rise, you actually have to perform well, and also the party being very eager about taking the popular pulse at every level, seeing how is this true, and is this because there is some kind of danger after all from the Chinese population, or in the end not really? I'd just like to hear you gauge this, because I don't know what the role of the Chinese people in all this is.
Well, I think that's a good series of questions. There are certainly dangers from the population in one sense. If there are roughly, and the original figures that we got on this were official figures, not dreamt up figures, but if there are roughly 500 demonstrations, riots, beating up of police stations a day in the country, that is a serious indication of popular unrest by any standards. And one of the reasons, I think, for the anti-corruption campaign is because it is corruption that is at the basis, the land grabs that of the peasants, that is at the basis of that. Not only, but... And the fact that if you go to a school, you have to pay, perhaps to the teacher, to get your kid in. You have to pay to hospitals. There's a nascent social security system, but it's not working yet. So that one of the objectives of the corruption campaign is to remove the corrupt flies, so that the people will be, 500 will go down to 400 to 300 a day demonstrations. So that would be a way of staving off popular dissent. My own feeling has been that the Chinese revolution was won in the countryside, but it'll be lost in the cities. The peasants are too far apart. They're kept apart by police and by military ultimately. so that the likelihood of a popular uprising, like the Taiping Rebellion or the Communist Party itself, getting any traction in a China so tightly ruled is very small. But in the cities, people can organize much more quickly. We saw this with the bourgeois revolt against the maglev in Shanghai, extending into nice areas, so that it stopped dead. We've seen it in the quick impact of things like that high-speed train going off the rails. So I think that there is no danger that Xi sees, but he does think that there is a long-term debilitating effect on the party if corruption goes on. So that at one point, some point, maybe the peasants will get together, or maybe there'll be a town-country fusion. What they want to avoid is any kind of ideological infiltration that could encourage that. That's why they are knocking the crosses off the Christian churches, knocking down steeples. Why they are attacking the influx of Western ideas. So I think that there is a feeling that the anti-corruption campaign will both improve the way that the meritocracy works, and the Confucian bureaucracy was a meritocracy. You think there was no corruption then? Of course there was. I mean, one of the reasons for being a bureaucrat was that it was a way that you could be corrupt. And that's why I said, why will anyone who's not in the party become a fly if he's not going to be able to be corrupt? So I think that I would attribute it, if you like, it based to patriotism. He doesn't want the country to be corrupt. He doesn't want it to be a massive banana republic, however prosperous the coastal areas are. So I think she is doing something which is high risk, but something which people would support, except when it affects them.
You began early, and you've given us so much. And you've got a plane to catch. Do you want to stop now, or?
Well, you said it went till 2. I've organized the plane so it doesn't take off before 2.
I have a very quick question about money. Maybe one of you can answer. If China can control information, I don't understand how it can't control money. And I thought it was illegal to take money out, and yet millions and millions of dollars are coming into this country and around the world buying up property against something that might happen catastrophically in China. How's that possible?
How do they do it?
Yes.
Bill, do you know how they do it? You've got friends?
Well, taking a lot of money out is quite legal. $50,000 per person. Compare that with South Korea at a similar level of development. They allow $500. So families can take out quite a lot. And tourists, Chinese tourists are the biggest spending tourists per day of any kind in the world, more than Germans, Americans, Japanese. A lot of money comes out when a company exports and imports. It changes the invoices around, so a lot of money stays overseas. Tens of billions stay abroad that way. Basically, the system is quite porous now, and they're committed to making it more porous. The whole thing of internationalizing the currency requires relaxation of capital controls. So enormous amounts of money can move, and a high proportion is legal, and they're trying to crack down on the over-invoicing, but it's very difficult. So that will go on.
An EB-5 visa is $500,000, right? Isn't that what you get? You get a new visa for $500,000 of investment in this country, and that. So that's if it's for a visa, it's legal.
Not necessarily.
It's not as difficult as you and I would find it, but we don't have that kind of money. At least I don't.
I think we need to thank you.
He did not join the elite Red Guards. He was eventually sent down to the countryside and was, according to an official biography, a mixed-up kid when he got to the countryside, but emerged from that countryside experience a potential leader of China. So we don't know. I have a former student who's now a professor in Hong Kong, Chinese, who is of that generation, who was a Red Guard leader, who was of non-princeling background and was a Red Guard leader. And he sort of has a soft spot for the idea that maybe a Red Guard generation leader will be something different. And I think so far he has proved to be something very different from the past. Now, what is Xi about? Well, first and foremost, he is about what all leaders of all governments are about, and that is the preservation of power, preservation of your party in power. In America and Britain, we have to submit to, regretfully in my case, to the judgment of the electorate. And you may be rejected, and the government may be rejected. But in the case of China, that's not currently an issue. And the issue is, how do you preserve the party in power? Why is that an issue? I mean, it's been in power since 1949. That's a long, long time. Why should it be an issue? I think it's an issue for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's an issue because the party was trashed during the Cultural Revolution. It was the target of the Cultural Revolution, not the intellectuals. They were just slapped away in passing, so to speak. The party was the target. Mao wanted to revolutionize the party, and the only way to do it was to thrust the Red Guards, the students, at them and see who stood up and who fell down and who rose above the tumult. And that trashing of the party resulted in a lack of legitimacy. You cannot see the high and the mighty paraded in a stadium and denounced and spat upon and made to do the airplane position and still feel that, who are these people? I mean, these people I should respect? No, it's not the attitude you would have towards people who've gone through that. And this happened from top to bottom. Many survived, of course, but the party itself as an institution was trashed. Even though Mao's idea was to rebuild the party as a more revolutionary organization, nevertheless, he undermined it in the process of doing that. Now, the party then emerges from the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping rehabilitates people, either posthumously or in reality, gives them offices, gives them apartments, gives them cars and chauffeurs, depending on their seniority. And it seems like the party will come back to normal. Surest way for them not to get to the top, as Bo Xilai proved. And so Xi Jinping bided his time. Hu Jintao did the same, but he didn't make waves even when he did come to power. And he was eventually selected as the leader to succeed Hu Jintao. Now, the important thing I would stress about his selection is, this is the first time since the selection of Mao Zedong himself that the leader of the Chinese Communist Party was selected by his peers. In the case of Mao, prior to Mao, people were basically selected by the Soviet-backed Comintern. Mao was the first one to be selected on the Long March as the leader, or obviously the potential leader. He wasn't actually made leader at that point, but clearly the up-and-coming leader by his peers in the desperate straits that they were in on the Long March. So after that time, leaders were selected by the leader. Mao selected his successors. Harvard professors can't do this, however much they try. The leaders were selected by the leaders. Mao had a series of lack of success. His final choice did succeed, but was quickly unseated. Deng Xiaoping also selected his successors, also with lack of success by his standards. But finally, his final selection, Hu Jintao, did succeed, and he stayed in power. So we have a new ball game. someone selected by his peers, and therefore someone who has not just been plucked out by a whim perhaps, or by a mistaken impression of someone's abilities and courage. But we then have someone who has been selected by his peers, and they haven't selected the others. The other 6 members of the Politburo Standing Committee were not selected, nor were the members of the Politburo, current Politburo, selected to take that leadership position. So in my view, this gives Xi Jinping a legitimacy over his colleagues which no previous leader has had. And I think that what we have seen over the last couple of years, 3 years, has been his exercise of that leadership that he has concealed carefully while he was coming up the provincial ladder, and now he is asserting himself in no uncertain way. The other thing you should know about Xi Jinping, and I don't know if we don't have enough examples yet, I think, to know if this is typical, is that he is a cultural revolution baby, so to speak. He is the first leader of China who went through the Cultural Revolution as a young person and was persecuted because his father had been purged, because Xi Jinping has been very much in the news, and of course this very day there's an article in the New York Times by a Chinese American who worked for a Chinese company as a teacher, and it seemed that everyone fiddles in China. Tax avoidance is rampant. And that'll be a little bit of what I want to talk about. But I can refer you to an article I wrote in last month's book issue of the New York Review, which probably will put out what I have to say more carefully than I will say today. It was written several weeks before it was published, and therefore it does not include what I will talk about briefly today, since I'm not an economist. That is the stock market gyrations in China and the government's attempts to do something about it. So, Xi Jinping is coming here this month for, among other things, a state visit to the American president, and all sorts of cries have been raised by people that he shouldn't be invited because of what's happening in China, but the visit will certainly go ahead. And he has become a very prominent figure in the world, much more prominent than his predecessor, Hu Jintao. Remember him? Probably not, but who was much more low profile. So let me say a few things first about Xi Jinping and why he's there as General Secretary of the party and President of China, which 2 offices now always go together. Xi Jinping is a princeling, which, as many of you will guess, means that he is the son of a senior revolutionary figure. In his case, not quite as senior as some princelings, but nevertheless senior enough to have been purged by Mao in 1962 and to have been resuscitated by Deng Xiaoping when Deng Xiaoping was able to do that. A man from the Northwest, a man of some honor, it's thou said, and one who was actually friendly with, I think, the Panchen Lama, which is held to his credit by people who are concerned about Tibet. So Xi Jinping was someone who it was possible to think of as the next leader of China, because under Hu Jintao, the rumors were coming out of Beijing that the elders were wanting a princeling to succeed. Hu Jintao, as I say, very low-key, was selected by Deng Xiaoping. Why, we don't know, but he was, and he led the country for...
I'm Harvey Mansfield, and this is the program on constitutional government, our Friday lunchtime series. The first of, I think, 5 meetings we've got scheduled for this fall. And our speaker today is Roderick MacFarquhar, who's Emeritus Professor Leroy R. Williams, Professor of History and Political Science at Harvard. That chair used to belong to one of my mentors, or at least early professors, William Yandell Elliott.
Yes, he was the scourge of one of my professors, John King Fairbank.
He was a kind of tyrant to me, too. So we all have good memories of him.
Later Benjamin Schwartz occupied that.
Benjamin Schwartz, yeah. So, and now Rod was formerly chairman of the Gov Department, one of our very best, perhaps rivaling James Q. Wilson for the best chair in the government department in the last 50 years.
There are too many colleagues here. Don't say this. Someone may contradict you.
I'm saying this. I'm old and I'm saying this. And he's also been director of the Fairbanks Center. Before coming to Harvard, he lived in a country called England, and he was a TV journalist and was elected to Parliament, which is a club of non-exclusive club elected by people from the outside. And to justify his being a professor, he's written books, and one of them is China Under Mao, and his famous trilogy on the origins of the Cultural Revolution, Mao's Last Revolution, and he's also edited and written part of the Cambridge History of China. So this is Rod MacFarquhar. He's going to talk for a little while, and then we'll have some questions. And I think he wants to speak from the podium with his due authority.
The first rule of agitprop is stand up. Well, I'm not going to talk about constitutional government in the true sense, because that's a dangerous subject in China. People who talk about the Constitution and attempt to implement it end up being in places that they don't necessarily want to be. So the Constitution in China exists. It's a very fine Constitution in many ways, but implementation is lacking in some respects. What I want to talk about today is the rise of Xi Jinping. I was asked whether or not I had something to recommend to people to read beforehand. I said anyone who reads the New York Times will probably know everything I'm going to say anyway for 8 years. But they figured that there should be a princeling to follow him, because both Hu Jintao and his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, had said that the country was in grave danger, the party was in grave danger because of the widespread corruption, which they both said could bring the party and the country, the communist state, down. And that's something which Xi Jinping himself was saying before he came to power. And they figured, the elders, that someone whose family was embedded in the revolution's history would be far more likely to want to exert himself, always a himself, for the preservation of the revolution than someone who was simply an apparatchik who had risen through the ranks by diligence. So there were at least two obvious princelings. Xi Jinping was not the most obvious one. The most obvious one, and the one who really did a sort of Donald Trump equivalent within the Chinese system, was Bo Xilai. Some of you will remember that he was the man who was purged just before Xi Jinping came to power, though he tried after. He was purged partly because of a dramatic case where his wife was accused of murdering a British citizen. But Bo Xilai had already aroused waves, exactly like Donald Trump roused waves, because he had proclaimed a sort of Maoist citadel in Chongqing, the city province which he ran, and he was already a member of the Politburo. It was clear he was electioneering to get the top job, or at least to get into the Politburo Standing Committee, which consists at the moment of 7 people who are the rulers of China. And I think that people felt that, as people feel about Donald Trump, that this was too much of a good thing. They wanted people who wouldn't make waves, and they certainly didn't want people who made waves which reflected the old Maoist ways. I don't believe for a minute that Bo Xilai was in fact a Maoist or had any ideas of restoring Maoism. It was simply a way to get the attention of his colleagues and to get into the top leadership. But be that as may, he was purged. Xi Jinping is a far different person. Willie Walder, a Hong Kong-based long-time analyst of the Chinese leadership, has given us a sketch of his background, suggesting that he did nothing big while he was in the provinces learning his way and moving up the greasy pole. And that obviously was the mark of his success, because no one in the Chinese system should make waves before they get to the top, because that's the